Today, it's my great pleasure to be here with two of the world's most significant national security experts on the topic of North Korea in particular, and the rising tensions that we've all been observing with greater and greater alarm. I'm going to try to keep this conversation as interactive as possible, so you will excuse me and they will excuse me if I periodically cut them off. I'm also going to try to figure out where they disagree with one another as much as possible, so that we can bring out some of the nuances of this topic as we go through the discussion. But I'd like to begin by asking each of them to say a few words about their personal experiences going into North Korea, because this is an amazing conversation to have between two people who have been in North Korea, and in Bill's case, been in North Korea 8 times, and been involved in negotiations with the North Koreans over the release of political hostages, the release of the remains of soldiers, the release of food and other items that have been negotiated. He also is the author of this very impressive and interesting book from the standpoint of negotiation theory called How to Sweet Talk a Shark. So Bill, since you know how to sweet talk sharks, tell us what that experience was like going into North Korea and negotiating around the release of political prisoners.
Well, Claire, first, thanks to the Perry House. What a great idea what you're doing. This is the most substantive discussion on North Korea that I know has existed. Two, thank you for that very great introduction, although you never mentioned my very brief presidential run, but that's okay. and third, listen to David Sanger, because everybody leaks to Sanger, so what he's going to tell you is what's going on. First, I've been to North Korea 8 times. You know, I always get called, you're the North Korea expert. The problem now is we don't know much about the new leader, or hardly anything. So everything that I've absorbed over those 8 visits has not been consistent with what the end game for this new leader, now 3 years, wants. What's North Korea like? They don't think like we do. They don't negotiate like we do, quid pro quos. It's a country where saving face is very important. It's a country where if you insult somebody by, remember I was there once when President Bush called the father a dwarf. I thought I was going to get killed because it was a supreme insult. So this is why I worry about the tweets and the personalization of this very tense situation on the peninsula.
So can you describe for us what it was like when you first went there, or what one of your intense negotiations was like? Because it's a fascinating description in your book.
My first negotiation was in the early 90s. I was a congressman, had been given a visa for the first time to look at the U.S.-North Korea intelligence relationship, which didn't exist. And the day I arrived, 2 American Air Force planes got shot down. And Secretary of State Warren Christopher, I remember, called me when I was in North Korea on my first day, and he said, you have to stop your mission and try to get these 2 out. 2 weeks later, I'd gotten nowhere. And the North Koreans, you say, okay, well, what do you want in return? No. They violated our airspace. They're aggressive. I finally got them out because it was a public opinion that pressured them so much that they gave me, one had perished and one came out a little later. But their idea, as I said, is, okay, quid pro quo. The quid pro quo North Koreans give you, Claire, is, okay, you're not going to agree to our position, but after a few days, a few weeks, you'll agree to our position. And that's the quid pro quo. So it's almost impossible. And you know, you've got the foreign ministry, the military, you've got the security forces. It's all a cult of personality and has to come down from the dear leader, the top. So you can't negotiate and come out with a result. They have all these prepared statements, and then you finish the prepared statements, you leave the negotiating table. Maybe as you're walking out, they'll say, okay, so what are you going to say when you leave Pyongyang? What did we agree on? And then you tell them, and they say no, and then you wait and wait and wait.
So how did you accomplish the release of those prisoners? And most recently, Otto Warmbier, although it didn't turn out that he was saved, unfortunately, but how did you accomplish it?
On the first one, Claire, I think what happened was I told the North Koreans, this was close to Christmas, I'd been there 2 weeks, and I said, I'm going to get these soldiers out or I'll never leave. And I think they got scared when I said that. They didn't want me there. But so they turned them over. I think the court of public opinion, this was like the early 90s. With Otto Warmbier, I think this is, I was very involved in that. And the North Koreans, they did a dastardly thing. They had this young man who was in a coma, who was severely mentally damaged from his trial, and they didn't tell anybody. They didn't let access by the Swedes to see how bad this kid was. The problem, Claire, was that in explaining this after I remember blasting them on TV, the way they treated Geneva Convention violations, they thought in their thinking that they had treated the young man, they had given him medicine, that he went into a coma. That wasn't their fault. So they were unaware of the damage that had caused us and the ill treatment of the young man. It's a different set of very programmed thinking that came from the top down.
So you understood what they wanted out of this contact with you, and somehow you have found a way of interacting with North Korean leaders that they will listen to. Can you describe at all what a conversation might be like that could lead to a positive result? And just a little more on this, and then I'm going to ask David about his experience.
I always believe you talk to the worst kind of people. That's been my, there's some, you don't talk to ISIS, you don't talk to others, but I think you've got to have mutual respect for each other. I try to meet once every 2 months with the ambassador in New York, the North Korean ambassador. I'm not an official of the government, so I can do that. I have a foundation that focuses on political prisoners. I'm of the view that the diplomats are the more moderate forces within the government. The military, this is a big question. Everybody thinks military are hardliners and that they're to the right of the leaders. I think differently because they have always been interested. You mentioned I brought 7 remains back in 2008, and they were sending a signal to the U.S. All right, let's start remains. We'll give you some remains, America. They like it because they get foreign exchange. It's a very poor country. They get $20,000 per remain. And I think that's a path forward through the military that we have not explored.
All right, so that's very interesting. We're going to return to some of those topics. David, you were last in North Korea in 1992, and I gather you have now been, or at that time, were banned from returning.
Well, they read.
What did you do to convince them to ban you?
I wrote a New York Times Magazine piece about our trip, and I guess they must subscribe to the Sunday paper.
They sure do.
And when that was all done, they sent somebody around from the North Korean community in Japan. I was the Tokyo bureau chief at the time, and explained to me that I really shouldn't spend a lot of time filling out all that paperwork to get the next visa. They have periodically let other Times reporters in, not for a while, but my good friend Nick Kristof was just there last week, along with one of our editorial writers, Carol Giamocco, and 2 of our videographers. When they do these trips, increasingly they keep you pretty well penned up and put you in the guest house. At least we got to stay in the Koryo Hotel, which I'm sure Bill has been in, which is their effort to sort of build a Western hotel. And for years, I kept a collection on my desk of the pamphlets they have down at the front desk, which are spend your honeymoon in North Korea. And it's got a little schedule, you know, go to the Kim Il-sung Memorial in the morning and the museum in the afternoon and the mass games in the evening. And every time I had a friend who was getting married, I would just sort of slip one into an unmarked envelope and drop it on them. I couldn't find any takers for that. It was a fascinating trip because they had designed this trip to take a group of people up to see a UN project at the Tumen River, which is just where Russia, China, and North Korea all meet. And the concept was that this river, because it's the confluence of the three countries, would be a great UN project to get a big trade port going. And I think nothing has happened in that Tumen River UN project in the 25 years since I have been there. But to get there, we had to take a train. On the train, we had to carry our own buses and our own fuel for the buses because you could get neither a bus nor the fuel up there. When a big train erupted in flame a few years later, I think I had a pretty good idea of what had happened. We had a wonderful picnic on a beach on the way up there near Sinpo, which is near one of their launch sites now. But they did warn us not to wander up and down the beach much after the nice lunch we had there, because they had mined the beach except for a narrow strip for the incoming South Korean invasion and American invasion. We did run into ordinary North Koreans. They were pretty programmed about what they said. If any of you are tempted to go do this trip, if you're squeamish about the facilities on a train, I do have to warn you that the bathroom was a hole down to the tracks. The tracks had not really been fixed up since the Japanese left in 1945. So we moved at about 7 to 10 miles an hour, which made the trip, well, next time you get ready to complain about Amtrak, just think about this one, okay? So,
all right, so let's turn now to assessing the risk that we currently face. One of the things that we didn't really talk about today is the real chances. How likely is it that we're going to see renewed kinetic hostilities on the Korean Peninsula? A few weeks back, Admiral Jim Stavridis, the now dean of the Fletcher School, said in this very spot that his estimation was a 10% chance of nuclear conflict on the North Korean Peninsula or emanating from the North Korean Peninsula, and a 30 to 40% chance of a significant conventional war. So that if you put those statistics together, about a 50-50 chance of a major conflagration, either conventional or nuclear. Would that be an assessment that you share?
I think those numbers, you know, plus or minus 10 or 15% on the conventional conflict, I think we're about right. I would add one more that we don't think about all that often. But North Korea is a place where the U.S. and one of its adversaries have been engaged in the most persistent cyber conflict that we've seen with almost any country. If you think about it, in the Snowden papers, we learned a lot about U.S. efforts to get up inside the North Korean intelligence community. We've had the North Korean attacks on Seoul, Dark Seoul. We've seen the North Korean attack on Sony. My colleague Bill Broad and I reported in February, after an 8 or 9 month investigation, about an extraordinarily complex U.S. cyber-led effort to manage to sabotage the missile launches of the mid-range missiles. They've then come back with WannaCry, which ended up really devastating the British hospital system.
Okay, so
there's been a lot of that in the cyber world. In the conventional world, what could trigger all of this? I can think of a few things. First of all, the North Koreans going off to intercept one of our intelligence air missions, similar to what drew Bill in his first trip. They've said that they now consider it within their rights to intercept an airplane, even if it's not in North Korean territory. They made that announcement just about 3 weeks ago. If they followed through on that, I could imagine a situation where the United States downed one of their planes. They retaliated with, in some way, against a South Korean island, attacks on Seoul, whatever, and getting to escalation. On the nuclear side, I don't think that the North Koreans will willingly toss a nuclear weapon because they know what would happen thereafter. But I could imagine a situation if they were in regime collapse of a North Korean colonel, general, whatever. We don't know exactly what kind of protections they have on their nuclear weapons, something that Joe worked on some in his time in non-proliferation, in the Proliferation Center. But I could imagine a situation in which a rogue North Korean military official decided that if the regime was going to go down, he was going to bring others down with him.
And so you see that as a more likely hypothesis than the standard way that we imagine a nuclear conflict could come about, which is a conventional war where escalating because one side begins to lose badly.
If the North Koreans thought they were losing badly and they thought that the regime was imperiled, that simply stopping the conventional conflict would not necessarily bring down the regime, maybe the regime would fall anyway, yes, I could see that.
Bill, how likely do you think the chances of an actual military, kinetic military conflict are on the North Korean peninsula, and how likely the possibility of nuclear escalation?
I'm going to go out on a limb and say quite unlikely. Here's why. I love Admiral Stavridis. I went to Fletcher. He's a great Renaissance diplomat, military leader, but and here's why. And the biggest unpredictability, I don't know if you got it, is our two leaders. You know, our leader and the North Korean leader. You don't know what they're going to do next. But I sense, and I've spent some time with our, National Security Advisor, Chief of Staff, they're not trigger happy. You think, well, they want to go this way with the public statements, but I think there's a rationality there. With Kim Jong-un, I'm going to go out on a limb. He's erratic. He's unpredictable. He's scared of his own shadow. I think he's worried about regime change. Somebody wants to take him out. I mean, he's taken out his own brother, his own aunt, his own uncle. I don't know who's next. He put his sister in a couple of days ago in the Politburo. But I think there's an element of an end game that he wants. Why is he doing all this? My theory is that, and there's always, and David, by the way, David Sanger, when I went to North Korea maybe 2 or 3 trips ago, I wanted to take Sanger to cover the trip. And the North Koreans said, no, we don't want to be Sangerized. That's what they said to me because of the past. So I ended up taking somebody who wrote about food anyway, which, was not. But my point.
You go to North Korea to write about food?
No, a New York Times reporter. But my point here is that, look, there's 150,000 Americans in the Seoul area besides the 25,000 troops. There are troops in Japan. There's 25 million South Koreans. The dilemma is a catastrophe that I think both sides, and Kim Jong-un, I'm going to say, I don't think he's suicidal. He would not last very long, but there would be enormous collateral damage. The danger is a miscalculation. I think it's more a fishing boat that might get hit by one side or a airspace violation, and both macho leaders start going nuts. I think the percentage is less than the Admiral mentioned, much less. And
Does that mean that you think, let me just interrupt you one second.
Yeah.
Do you think that the apparent escalation in the past few months is only that, sort of that it's business as usual and a lot of posturing, but you don't take it as real escalation. Is that sort of what you're saying?
No, it is real escalation. I mean, look, Kim Jong-un has tried to put a warhead on his missiles. Their missiles are, they can reach Alaska, they can reach Hawaii, Guam, continental United States. I don't think they're there yet with a warhead, but they're very close.
David, do you agree with that? That they're not there yet? They haven't miniaturized nuclear weapons?
I think that they're very close to being able to reach the United States with a missile. But being able to reach the United States with a missile that is actually armed with a nuclear weapon that's small enough to fit inside the nose cone and that can survive the re-entry, because remember, when you launch an intercontinental ballistic missile, it leaves the atmosphere and comes back in. It took the United States years to figure out that technology. We burned up an awful lot of warheads on the way to doing it. It's not easy. And so if there's one thing that is buying time for Bill Richardson to solve this problem, it is that it's going to take them a while, I think, to get the warhead done. Now, that said, our intelligence estimates of recent times have been pretty poor. Okay, we did not see their rapid move to solid fuel technology. We did not see their rapid move to a new kind of Russian-designed engine. So we've been taken by surprise by some things. So you can't take to the bank the estimates that you hear.
Right. All right. So Bill, let me go back to you. So you were saying it's not that you think it's fake escalation. There is real escalation, but you still put the chances pretty low.
I still do. I think what Kim Jong-un wants to do, and again, nobody's talked to this guy except Dennis Rodman. Remember that? And, he saw a North Korean, a Chinese envoy once, but nobody knows what makes the guy tick. I think he's not like his father. His father, Kim Jong-il, was a deal maker. He takes a prisoner, you go there, he wants Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, lower scale, Bill Richardson. In exchange, you get the prisoner back. He made an agreement with Bill Clinton, which, the right is vilifying Clinton in the 90s, called the Agreed Framework. But the reality is that for 9 years, the North Koreans didn't build a nuclear weapon while that agreement was enforced. Now, what did they want in return? Nuclear weapons, nuclear power centers, food, economic assistance, lifting some sanctions. The North Koreans cheated in the end and got out of the agreement because they thought President Bush wasn't going to honor it. I don't know, but they got out of it to their detriment. But the son, I think he wants to be able to say, I can reach now the United States, my maximum nuclear negotiating position. And this is why he's put all his money in the military. The people there are starving. The economy is getting a little better, but still people it's like $10 a month. These, mainly in the military, they put a lot of people in the military as salaries. There's a scarcity of food, especially in the rural areas. I think eventually there's an end game where he wants something, but it's more in the psychological area, Claire. It's more, I want to be a big power along with you, the U.S. Don't send me China. Don't send me South Korea. We're the major powers. Let's reach an agreement. Treat me with respect. I'm ready to engage. I'm not saying he's going to do all this, but I think there's got to be an end game, and I think his military is a source of moderation, and I'll explain why later. I know you're very good. You're a very good moderator. You don't want me to get into everything.
All right. So following up on your invitation to interrupt you, let me say that we have an end game. You focused us on an end game of they want respect. Another end game is economic. They want cash. And to that end, of course, we've seen significant conventional weapons production, and they sell it. They sell these all over the place. So here's a question. We treat the recent noises, escalatory speech, as though it were provocation. And we treat the testing as though it were intended to be provocation to us. is it possible that they are testing these weapons as advertising, right? We can show you, potential buyers, how good our weapons are. Come see how well they function. Do you think that's plausible, David?
I've always thought that there's an element in all of their testing, both nuclear and missile testing, of advertising. They've sold missiles for decades to Pakistan, to Iran, to many other customers. They've sold small arms. There was a great incident during the Bush administration where arms were interdicted on their way to the Middle East. I think this was to Sudan, if I remember correctly. And when the U.S. tried to stop it, suddenly we're dealing with other governments saying, hey, we already paid for those, Now, many of these transactions are banned by UN resolution now. And if you had an effective mechanism for stopping and intercepting North Korean shipping, you'd probably pick up a lot more of it. There was just a very good Washington Post piece about an arms shipment that was found in Egypt just a few months ago. So if you look across the sources of their revenue, it's increasingly scarce given the sanctions. Arms sales is certainly one. They used to make a lot of money from counterfeiting. They made spectacularly good counterfeit $100 bills. I keep one above my desk. I haven't spent it at Starbucks or anything, but it's a good North Korean fake. The Treasury Department did a very good job on cracking down on that with the redesigned bills. And that is one of the reasons that they have chosen cyber as a way to go try to steal money. And in fact, the attack on the Bangladeshi bank, central bank, which netted them $81 million, was intended to net them $1 billion. They made a spelling mistake in doing the bank transfer. You've always got to check your spelling when you're doing bank transfers.
Presumably, if they can end up being able to have the capacity to miniaturize nuclear weapons, not only can they put them on warheads and direct them towards Hawaii and California, not to mention, of course, South Korea, but they can sell them as well.
They could. They recognize that there's a few red lines out here, and we've never actually seen them selling an actual nuclear weapon, and they've had larger ones that they could. They did sell the Syrians a complete replica of the Yongbyon reactor, the one that I had written about in the late 80s. When we finally saw photographs of that reactor, shortly after the Israelis redecorated it one night, it was a perfect replica of Yongbyon, and we believe, although have never been able to prove, that more North Korean workers were killed in that Israeli raid than Syrian workers were killed in that Israeli raid.
Bill, you wanted to get in there.
I guess I'm going to disagree with David. I don't think they're doing it to advertise, to sell. I don't think they care about the welfare of their people. I really don't. The economy is in terrible shape. People, especially in the rural areas. I don't think that's an end game goal of Kim Jong-un. He's secure. It's a cult of personality. He's never going to get, there's not going to have an election, so that helps. But he's not going to be toppled. So his goal is military, nuclear, missile, enormous strength. And then he will use that. Now, foreign exchange for them, David's right, is very important. The time I went that negotiating the release of the pilots, we were getting the good news, we were going to get the pilots. I said, but you got to pay us for all your phone calls to, Warren Christopher. I said, how much is that? Well, $10,000. No, it's true. I did pay it. Well, the Pentagon paid it. I get, well, what the hell? And then
You spent $10,000 to call him?
It was $10,000 worth of calls. And then the second thing.
Did you get a copy of the phone bill?
Yeah, I did take it. And then the second, they wanted me to, this is a true story, to pay for the ammunition that they shot down our pilots. They were serious. I said, no. They dropped that, but they mentioned it. It was on their list.
Extraordinary.
So my point is this. I just think that on the economy front, I'm going to say, you don't want to get into what we should do now, right? But because I want to say, there are two things I think the Trump people have done right on North Korea. Don't ask me about the rest of the world, my God. And I'm really worried. I told David as we started, if we get out of this Iran deal, that's going to have implications with the North Koreans. They're going to say, oh, you made a deal with Iran and nuclear, now you're getting out of it? Why should we make one with you? I mean, this is how people think, although they don't think like we do. This is very logical. But the two things that I don't know if you've gotten into this. One is the China approach of the Trump administration makes sense. Find ways to pressure China in some way. I won't get into how I think we should do it. Maybe that's the latter part.
Yeah.
The second is the sanctions. We now have sanctions in North Korea that could have some bite in the short term if China enforces them. And I think they are starting to realize the sanctions are on coal. The sanctions it's a cap on oil exports. Seafood, that's significant. North Korean workers working in China that can't bring exchange back in. Some of these banking sanctions. One of the things that we found in the administration, the Clinton days, and later Obama, though I wasn't in that administration, is if you put sanctions on the leadership, on bank accounts of the cabinet secretaries, the presidents, the spouses, so they don't go shopping in Paris or Philadelphia. My friend Bob Bassler always used to take, you have a great store here called Boyd's. You still have it? Right, Bass? Remember that? Anyway, why did I bring that up? But my point is that those are two elements in a possible, not solution, or easing of tensions. There's no solution.
Right, good.
All we can do is ease tensions.
So just before we get to solutions, and that will include discussion of sanctions, the last thing on the military technology, because I think it's really important for us to understand what we're negotiating about. We talk about negotiations with North Korea, but that could mean a lot of different things. So what exactly are we seeking to accomplish? In addition to a large conventional arsenal, right, and sales of that arsenal to other countries, potentially, whatever the motivation around it is, and seeking to reduce offensive nuclear capacity, there's also the issue of anti-ballistic technology, such as the THAAD technology and the Aegis system. And as I understand it, it's very plausible to think that North Korea would really like to see a reduction in that technology from South Korea, from us, that is around them and available. And is that something that we want to put on the table as something to negotiate around?
I can't imagine right now that this administration, or even the Obama administration, would put the anti-missile technology on the table, and I'll lay out why. When we wrote that story that appeared in March about the cyber attacks on the Musadan missile tests, and we traced back to the decision-making that went on in the Obama administration, and particularly in January and February of 2014, when President Obama ordered an acceleration of this, we went back to look at why it was that the president was so intent on attempting cyber attacks on North Korea. Well, partly it was that because of Olympic Games, which had been the code name for the attacks on the Iranian centrifuges, he had gotten sort of more comfortable with using cyber weapons, though the administration never discussed it publicly. But secondly, he had lost confidence in our ability to intercept these missiles using our conventional missile defenses. Now, you can't wrap all these missile defenses together. We have two major kinds. There is the one that is used in Alaska and California, and that is intended to pick off ones or twos or threes of North Korean missiles headed for the continental United States. It was built with the current crisis in mind, and was actually rather foresighted of both Democratic and Republican administrations to get it there. I think we now have 44 or 46 anti-missile batteries in place. The problem is that under ideal conditions, when we test these, they work fully 50% of the time. Okay, if you're living in LA or San Francisco, you might find that less than fully heartening. We have much higher success rates with the missile interceptors that are on these ships, the Aegis ships, and with the THAAD interceptors, which are on Guam and off of in Japan and now in South Korea, but they are not intended for the intercontinental ballistic missile. They are made to go pick up, a bullet hits a bullet of a warhead as it's descending, but it's not made for the intercontinental
And that's
systems.
important. Let me just stop you right there. As it's descending, right? So you've got a very narrow window.
You have a narrow
You
window.
missed that window.
And you missed that, right. And you've actually taken us to a very important point, Claire, because if you wander around the Pentagon these days, there is a huge scramble on to actually do more in the way of missile defense.
Yeah.
There's discussion of the missile defenses that you could put on drones. There's a discussion of reviving a failed effort to build a laser program that would be able to get these missiles in the boost phase. Now, there's another way to go do this, but it increases Stavridis' numbers, which is you see a liquid-fueled missile being loaded up on the pad, and the Pentagon can see these, and Bill used to probably see them when you were, obviously you'd see the satellite photographs, and now we see them because commercial satellite photography is good enough that, you know, I get every few days pictures of the North Korean launch sites. And you could take out a missile on the pad, and it is certainly something the Trump administration has thought about.
Or cyber hack it, right?
If you can cyber attack it and be successful, and our cyber attacks were somewhat successful for a while, and then the North Koreans moved on to a different kind of missile, and it stopped being successful. Right. So there's cyber as a possibility, and then there's the old-fashioned way of putting a cruise missile right through it. The problem is, how do the North Koreans respond to an attack on their missiles, a preemptive attack on the pad, which is a different thing from attacking it when it's already in flight.
In the air. Okay, good. So let's talk now about diffusing the crisis and the diplomatic side of this. So the strategy around the Iran deal was to pile up sanctions for a while and then to try to approach negotiations with Iran very narrowly, bracketing out human rights abuses, bracketing out all sorts of differences that we may have with that regime, and just to focus on reduction of the nuclear building capacity in various ways, and to set the sights somewhat limited. So there's a blueprint for negotiations that involves sanctions and in combination then with direct negotiations. In your view, Bill, is that the kind of approach that would work in this case, and how would you go about it?
Well, I would start out by, agreeing with David on we have to do the best research to prevent, a missile coming into the United States. The Pentagon's doing it, whether it's imperfect or not. We need to do that. We don't give up the THAAD missile with South Korea. That should continue. This is another issue, how we deal with South Korea. We're not getting along. That would help if we had a, better relationship. But I think what we're talking about in terms of a potential solution, first, not a solution, it's a short-term easing of tensions, which might lead to a longer negotiation, hopefully, but we don't know. So what is the short term? I think the short term is what Tillerson is trying to do, but the president is undercutting him. I wonder, is this a game or not? I don't know. I don't know Trump. It bothers me that you can't undercut a Secretary of State. And I think the Secretary of State should not have said, well, I've got 2 or 3 channels. Well, he shouldn't have said that. Just do the damn channels. Don't telegraph.
Bill, I was in the room when he did it because I was in Beijing on his trip. And, a lot of people think reporters sort of extract stuff from people. He volunteered this.
Did he?
To us.
All right. Well,
okay.
I think he was, he
It was in the
sending messages
living
too.
room of the ambassador.
The answer is a freeze for a freeze, short term. Now, this is the freeze, and it's imperfect. In exchange for a dialogue, the United States stopped some military exercises, unspecified with the South Koreans, something that is not, violate the mutual treaty, some kind
But
of...
not pulling our THAAD
No,
technology.
no, not at all. No, you keep that. The North Koreans stopped testing, like for, I don't know how long, 60 days. Don't test, no missile activity, just be quiet, and total impossibility. But then within those 60 days, find the two secretaries of state or a special envoy or somebody to plan the next series of talks. Now, the Trump administration, denuclearization, they got 20 nuclear weapons. They're not going to get rid of their nuclear weapons, but you strive for a strong bargaining position. You don't announce, okay, we're going to let you stay nuclear. And I think the focus should be more on missile activity, on them agreeing to some kind of inspections. I mean, I'm talking longer term.
What do the North Koreans get out of it?
That's the big question. They will want, I would think as a minimum, an ending of their armistice, the declaration of war. I think they're going to want an easing of sanctions.
But first, you have to pile the sanctions up right before you can ease them.
Right.
Would you say?
But yeah, and this is where I think China has to play more of a role, not in putting pressure on North Korea, but I've got another idea where I think the complex situation, it's got to be synchronized, our U.S. policy, and it's not. Diplomatic, military. We say to China, okay, so you don't want to put real pressure on North Korea? We're gonna put some bases here. We're gonna, the Japanese, maybe they should get an army and rearm again. Maybe in South Korea we do the THAAD and plus a little more. Maybe your naval stuff, we're going to put a real presence here. I think the pressure on China is not economic. Yeah, I mean, you put sanctions on them and, trade restrictions. They're doing so well, that's not going to affect them. It's a geopolitical new policy by the U.S. that says to China, you got to really put pressure, and that's the cross-border smuggling. You don't allow in and enforce sanctions. I think that is a source of pressure. My last point is, what does Kim Jong-un want? I mean, I don't know. I mean, that should be the best question. Our intelligence people, they're good, but they missed the boat on this one. I always felt on intelligence, I don't know if you've got some experts here, that for years, and Sanger, God, he's got more sources in intelligence than anybody else, but I really think we missed the boat when we concentrated all our intel resources on technology and Russia instead of on good old-fashioned human intelligence in the Muslim, Arab world. We had so many Russia specialists at a time when, we do need them now with Russia, but for years, they were not a threat. And so what I'm saying is we need to develop stronger intel sources in places like North Korea and the Muslim world.
So just one more question on this line, which is, if the carrot is going to be we reduce sanctions, was it a mistake for the UN Security Council not to enact stronger sanctions? Of course, we couldn't get the cooperation of the Chinese and the Russians. How much do we expect to get out of really strong sanctions? How much would it be felt?
Well, Claire, the reason we can't get those sanctions is not a mistake. That Russia and China would veto it. China would have vetoed them.
Right.
I mean, I was UN ambassador during the Iraq War. You had to thread the needle, or the two would veto.
So how much are we missing by not having stronger sanctions? What kind of role do they play?
I think they're still significant enough so in a short period of time, they may have some bite. Now, the big sanctions are oil exports. We didn't do that. Or cargo, inspecting cargo ships that come into North Korea. And David's right. They sell a lot of nuclear materials to Syria, to Pakistan, to anybody that'll buy them. That's how they get some foreign exchange, that technology.
David, what do you think on the sanctions issue? How important are they?
Well, I thought it was interesting that last week at a public session that the CIA conducted down at George Washington University, they rolled out some of their North Korea experts, and they were asked, what is the assessment about whether or not there is a point at which the sanctions will get severe enough that the North Koreans would actually recalculate whether the nuclear program was worth it. And the answer they got back, and I take Bill's point and agree with it, that we've frequently made mistakes in our assessments. The answer they got back was, we assess that there is no amount of economic pain that can be imposed on North Korea that will force them to give up a nuclear program that they consider protecting the existence of the state, that for them it is existential. So I took the assessment and I went back to the administration and I said, okay, the CIA publicly says that their assessment is sanctions will not change the North Korean calculus. So explain to me again the logic under which we are constantly increasing the sanctions. And I got one of those, so what's your next question, okay? Now, there is an argument for doing this, which is that you try to exhaust every other option before you have to go turn to something military. And I think that Secretary Tillerson is very serious about trying to do that. When we were in Beijing, I was with him there a weekend before last, he was trying to persuade the Chinese to crack down even further on the oil exports. There's a single pipeline that runs through. I don't think the Chinese are going to do that because they still value the importance of having a buffer state between China and South Korea and its American allies more than they value denuclearizing North Korea. I wouldn't be shocked if at some point in the next year or two, some awful industrial accident might happen to the North Korean side of that pipeline, and the Americans turn around and say, you guys really got to keep up the preventative maintenance. It's really important.
Sorry, you want to chime in there?
No, you go ahead.
All right, so let's now talk about this administration and what has been going on. So on the surface, of course, it looks like a complete chaos and a circus with Tillerson.
You should see what it looks like when you have to go dig down every day.
Well, that's my question, really. So someone fairly knowledgeable in this area I was consulting in preparation for today said, I think there's method in the madness. It's a good cop, bad cop routine. Don't assume that this is as chaotic as it appears to be. Today we talked earlier in the second panel about the real importance of having a consistent approach across the administration so that you don't have the Secretary of State engaging in one line and the president undercutting him on the other. What really is going on? Is this rational or irrational?
Well, I think apart from the rhetoric and the tweets, I would agree with Bill. I think the administration, if you just look at their actions, has a lot to be given some credit for right now. There's no reason the Obama administration could not have gotten much greater sanctions from the UN, except that they chose to focus on the Iran agreement, as you said, and then did not pivot to North Korea fast enough once the Iran agreement was reached in the summer of 2015. And by that time, we were already seeing the acceleration of the missile tests and the nuclear tests. And remember, Kim Jong-un has now done more missile and nuclear tests than his father and grandfather combined.
So you're giving credit on the sanctions side, okay. But what about on the diplomacy
on the rhetoric side?
Yeah.
So Secretary Mattis and Secretary Tillerson have been pretty well sewn up on this. The president has been all over the map. When Maggie Haberman and I interviewed him as candidate Trump, and I talked to him at some length about North Korea, and you can get the transcripts of this from the Times website, he said he was personally willing to go negotiate directly with Kim Jong-un. At another point with another reporter, he said that he would be willing to have a hamburger with him I don't know if Kim Jong-un eats hamburgers, but if he did, I thought that was a friendly gesture.
Maybe kimchi would be better.
Could be. I'm not sure that Donald Trump eats kimchi, but it would be an interesting thing to discover. He even made this offer again as president in an interview with the FT. Okay. But when Secretary Tillerson said what he said and said that these channels are open, as you say, he cut him off at the knees. Right. I went back and said, come on, guys, this is like a good cop, bad cop thing, right? And everybody said to me, we wish it was a good cop, bad cop thing.
Yeah, Bill.
You know, I mentioned I'm not an insider in the Trump administration, far from it. I don't believe in this theory of method to the madness. I think there's dramatic disorganization at the same time. I think he's got two solid people that I've met and talked to about this, McMaster and Kelly. I don't know the rest. I don't know Mattis, but he sounds like he's not trigger happy. He's restraining. I guess I'm a believer in the Senator Corker theory, where Corker is saying that a lot of good people are restraining the president. That's where I'm at. Now, then the next question is, will the president change? I doubt it. I don't think he's going to change at all. So we have to live with this. Now, so where do you go from here? I just think there's a diplomatic solution short term. But, you know, one area we haven't talked about, and I like the fact that the Perry World House, you got a lot of young people here. You know, the best thing I ever did with North Korea was those remains. That opened up a little bit between our militaries. We also got some North Korean doctors to go to New Mexico State University. We trained them 3 or 4. You know, the soft power, Claire, you know, like educational interchanges, sports. I mean, they love sports.
Basketball.
Yeah, they love, you know, I used to take movies to Kim Jong-il. He loved the Sundance Kid. You know, what I'm saying is there are areas of interchange that we have not explored. You know, maybe you guys have some interchange with their law school, although you might get captured like at Pyongyang University. So
it's a downside.
Hold off on that.
So let me just ask to follow up with a last question about this before we open the conversation to the audiences. You know, at the end of his presidency, Richard Nixon was being similarly contained. If you don't think this is method in the madness, then there is a containment problem, right? Not just containing North Korea, but containing the president. So at the end of his presidency, it's been described that that Richard Nixon was drinking a lot, and there was an effort to keep the nuclear codes away from him. Short of invoking the 25th Amendment, if you think that this guy is really out of control, can't be trusted with the codes, is that a plausible scenario? Well, let me throw it to David first.
Bill ran the Energy Department. The Energy Department is custodian to our nuclear weapons until they're turned over to DOD. So he knows a lot more about this than I do. But from the time that my colleague Bill Broad and I have spent on this, the way the system works, there is no legal way for a Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, or anyone else in the command line to defy a presidential order to launch a nuclear weapon. They can try to slow walk it. They can pretend they didn't have it on time. They could spend a lot of time trying to authenticate it. There is a process for making sure that it is a legitimate order, which is to say that it actually came from the president, that nobody had intercepted that in between. But there is no legal basis by which they can turn it down that we can find.
Bill?
We're not at that stage. You know, I got to say this. I'm very concerned about the direction of our country. I worry every 3 hours I get a call from a TV station, the latest tweet, I can't keep up with the very damaging tweets, but I think we're a nation of laws, and we're not there yet. I think that He's got people around him that I think are going to come through and bring some rationale. We also have a Congress. They're not necessarily, doing terribly well, but, we got the press. We've got people on the streets. We got, a Democratic Party, and I'm not going to get partisan, that is trying to get its act together, with some difficulty, but, at least people are energized. You got more women running. I see a lot of women. According to Emily's list, more women are going to run for office, like 30% more, just because of what's happening in our country. I think that is really healthy. Now, so what do? We hope he changes. I don't think so, the president. Kim Jong-un is not exactly also a very consistent actor here. So we go through our process, but I don't think we're at the 25th Amendment unless this investigation on Russia, Mueller, shows something. I mean, then we got to look at it. But,
do you think that if, as the investigation heats up and we get closer to a report on the Trump campaign and the Trump administration's ties with Russia, do you think this tension with North Korea and the tweets and the provocation is likely to go down or up?
It's very hard, first of all, to figure out if there's a correlation between the two. So far, we haven't seen one. And secondly, as Bill suggests, we don't know where the Mueller investigation is going. They are looking at a lot of different issues, but the one that would go directly to the president, which would be collusion that he was aware of, we have not seen direct evidence of at this point. So hard to know what drives these tensions, and a lot of it is not in the hands of the president. A lot of it's in the hands of Kim Jong-un. But I think this does return us to a point that Bill made early on, which I completely agree with. Kim Jong-un is an unknown quantity. He has a much higher risk tolerance than his father or his grandfather. We see that in the cyber side, and we've seen it in the nuclear testing, and we've seen it in the missile testing. In Donald Trump, we have somebody who prides himself in not backing down, in being the master negotiator who is willing to escalate to de-escalate. When you put those two together, the chance for miscalculation rises significantly beyond where I think it was with Kim Jong-un's father and beyond where it was with President Clinton, President Bush, or President Obama.
All right, the floor is open. Great, and I think, Stuart.
We don't know much about the guy.
Hang on, wait for the mic. Okay.
If we don't know much about the guy and he talks to Dennis Rodman, why aren't we getting as many Dennis Rodmans there as we can? Each one collects a little bit of intelligence and we know some more. Whether it's the doctors, as you said, or the other sports figures, or kimchi makers, or concert pianists.
I just want to identify.
And it doesn't have to be with the government either. It can be on our own.
Stuart Diamond, who is an expert in negotiations, and we're very glad to have him here, so he has his own.
Used to work with David.
Stuart, I called Rodman once after he came back. We didn't communicate too well. I mean, I said, Rodman, what's he like? Tell me, what did he say to you? I mean, just little stuff. And I think others have, and I told our intel people, go talk to Rodman, try to find something. I don't know if they ever did. But you're right, you want a little nugget. And, I suspect we've talked to this Chinese envoy that once met him. Defectors come back. I mean, sometimes their information is valuable. Other times it isn't. I don't think their defectors high enough. One thing that the military there, I think there's an opening through the remains issue of our soldiers. That's good for us. There's so many families, close to 1,000, that deserve some answer on the remains of their families. And the North Korean military, whether it's just because of foreign exchange or they like the military to military, I've always pushed for that. they gave us 7. And I went to get them with, Republicans and Democrats. We got them back, and we didn't bite and say, okay, well, let's start talking about renewing this program. But I think there's the big powers there, Kim Jong-un, the security forces, the security, not military, security. I think the military, they're moderate. The foreign ministry, they're moderate. I mean,
Bill, are you suggesting that if you negotiate for other things, that helps to build up a reservoir of goodwill that you can then use to start negotiating on other things?
Yeah, and they're not sexy with the New York Times or, although Sagard knows.
Start conversations on something.
Absolutely.
Right?
Sports. One time they said, if you bring Michael Jordan here, I passed that on, and I wasn't going to call Jordan. He didn't go, but they love the basketball tournaments. This, huh?
You don't need Trump's permission to do that. You can just talk to Congress, and they can get details.
Yeah.
And remember that, of course, Bill Clinton sent Kim Jong-il a condolence note when his father died. And apparently Kim Jong-il said, that meant so much to me. So that when journalist Laura Lynn was taken prisoner there, they said, well, send Bill Clinton over. And Bill Clinton was able to convince the North Koreans to free her because there was that personal relationship.
And then there was a wonderful moment when President Obama sent Jim Clapper over, the Director of National Intelligence. And so if any of you know Clapper, his personality is a little different than Bill and a little different than Clinton. And I wrote, when he got, I think, 2 people out, right?
Yeah.
Who came out on his plane. And he went and he met and had dinner with the director of the Reconnaissance General Bureau, which is sort of the North Korean CIA. The 2 wonderful things out of that dinner. First, the director of the Reconnaissance General Bureau stuck Clapper with the bill for dinner. Which was tough because you can't use your Visa card in North Korea. But the second thing was they were running the Sony attack at the time, and U.S. Intel had not picked up that the Sony attack was happening. So it was interesting. They were having dinner with the guy who sort of was directing it, and they didn't realize this was coming. When they did get them out, I wrote on the front page of the Times that the Obama administration had sent the perfect envoy, sorry, Bill, because he was a remnant of the Cold War, which Clapper was. He had been an intelligence officer throughout the Cold War, and was kind of hardtack, and he would like stand right up and talk to the North Koreans, sort of more like the North Koreans than anybody else you could think of in the administration. And I thought at that, well, I'm done with Clapper. He loved it. Keeps citing that reference to as a dinosaur from the Cold War back in his speeches. So you never know what it is they're looking for.
Claire, one last point here. Our policy in the past has been, we don't talk to countries that are bad because we're rewarding bad behavior. In other words, just to talk, we won't talk to them because Jesus, I mean, I know I am very proud of this country, but we don't need that standard. In my view, I mean, talk to the guy's got nuclear weapons.
Might be worth a conversation.
In other words,
or 2.
Talks without conditions. Just see each other in the hallway and say, hey, you're overdoing these missile tests. And then and they say, well, you're overdoing these. Well, all right, so let's talk. No, this was done in Obama did it, Bush did it. I said, Jesus, the one thing I liked about when Tillerson said we got a channel is, maybe this channel means there's something that none of us know about.
Tillerson
Tillerson
has been very clear that he wants to get a conversation going. That's why it was.
Mattis reports today, or I guess it came out today, that Mattis says, he agrees with both of them. In fact, there's no daylight between them, but talks are stopped per the president.
That's the.
They won't do it until there is, as Bill suggested, some period of time, and they haven't defined what this is, when there are no tests, nuclear.
And they haven't had a missile test in, I think, 13 days. Or what is it, 14?
Hey, yeah, right.
Give it another week. I don't know.
So, yes.
Thank you. Governor Richardson, I actually wrote to you 13 years ago when I was in the hospital. You actually wrote back to me.
Did I?
Yes, you did, sir. My question is, what do you believe that Kim Jong-un is afraid of his own shadow, which you said, I believe, over this past summer? And what is your take on this whole Dreamers going on right now in the United States?
Well, I love the Dreamers. You know, I think this repeal of the deferred action, the DACA plan, is terrible. These are young men and women that are patriotic. They're Americans, 800,000 of them. You know, so I'm unconditionally support what President Obama did in that executive order. Now, on Kim Jong-un, I think he came in unsure of his power base. I think the first year, he took out his uncle, who was very high up. I think he's brought loyalists in. He went after his own brother, his own half-brother, because he thought the Chinese were grooming him for leadership. I still think he's very unsure of his power base, although I believe his power base is very strong. He's very concerned, I believe, and Sanger's got better intel sources than I do, that the US or the South Koreans want to take him out. I mean, there was a report on the cyber that someone wanted to decapitate him. You know, I don't know if that's true. Who knows? But yeah, I think that's part of the problem. He's got a big ego. He loves being on the world stage. You notice the North Koreans, you know, people worry about their rhetoric. They've always had this rhetoric. Oh, we're going to kill the giant from the United States. They're terrible people. All of that, South Korea, you know, lectures, everything. But what has not been consistent here and is a little worrisome, it was always the North Korean news agencies, foreign ministry, that made those statements. This time it's Kim Jong-un. So it shows a level of fear on his part, insecurity, but also he loves to be on the world stage. And this is why it's an ego thing that, you know, just calling him Rocket Man is just not good. I mean, why do it? All right,
So,
you know, he's...
So let's take another question, and let me ask you to restrict your questions to the topic of the symposium, however interesting it is to hear about Dreamers and other topics. Sir.
You know, and I don't like the President of the United States insulted either. It goes both ways, so...
There seems to be a general consensus that the greatest leverage that the world has against North Korea is through the Chinese. The question then is, what's the way to maximize leverage with the Chinese to get them to change the calculus so they put increased pressure to change what's going on in North Korea? It seems like the best shot, short of military action. How do you accomplish that?
You know, as I said, I'll give Trump credit for probing that issue more than other presidents. Here's my view. I think the Chinese deep down like the turmoil that the North Koreans cause us there. They like it, that, you know, we're worried about, you know, nuclear weapons and number one. Number two, it's not always certain that the North Koreans listen to the Chinese. I mean, they're very proud. You know, there's an element, okay, you're helping us, but we're going to do what we want. And they haven't visited North Korea, the Chinese, vice versa, so there's tension. Third, I think it's 90% of goods and services, food, energy, goes through China into North Korea. So sanctions, if applied properly, avoiding cross-border smuggling, could work. Now, so you say to yourself, why don't the Chinese want North Korea to tame down? Well, there's several reasons. One, they don't want an explosion. This is a contrary view of refugees going from North Korea to China. They don't want an implosion. Secondly, I think what the Chinese don't want is North and South Korea to get together, because that screws up their geopolitical agenda. So one of the things that I've suggested is a new military approach between the United States and China, where we basically get in their face militarily, not provoke them, but presence, and more presence in Japan, more presence in the region. Just say, hey, you're overdoing it with some of these, sea lanes that you're doing.
David, I'd like to ask you to weigh in on the China issue. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on it.
Here's an area where I think the Trump administration is moving in the right direction, because they recognize that if they are going to change the Chinese calculus, they've got to give the Chinese a reason to believe that what China wants most, which is stability in North Korea, is going to be most at risk if the North Koreans stay on their current path. The Chinese have always believed in the end that the United States will not take military action against the North for all of the obvious reasons. That in the end, the North Koreans will not be driven to the point of collapse, which could lead to a South Korean takeover of the North. And that the US military presence in the region, if anything, was going to diminish, because President Trump said, as candidate Trump, in those same interviews that Maggie and I did, that he wanted, if anything, to pull back from the Pacific. In fact, he left open the possibility that Japan and South Korea could get their own nuclear weapons. So what do they need to do? Not take away the missile defense, but to say, if North Korea stays on this path, we're going to have to surround you with missile defense, which of course the Chinese think would be aimed at them. That we're going to have to greatly increase the number of troops on the Korean Peninsula and in Japan, and that we're going to have to greatly increase our naval presence, just at the time that the Chinese are trying to push the US back beyond the first island chain.
Do you agree with what
I do.
David just said? That's
I do.
interesting.
No, I said, I didn't say it clearly, because sometimes I don't speak clearly, but yeah, get in their face. In other words, more naval, more of a U.S. military
But
presence.
doesn't that risk the very escalation
but it
we're
gets
trying
to
reduce?
China that we are damn serious about
It's aimed at the Chinese more than it's aimed
regardless
at the North
of
Koreans.
their actions, Claire. China has the leverage, the economic leverage. They're the 80% of 90% of all the goods going in are from China.
But Claire, you raise actually another interesting question. If you really flip the calculus, if you were successful at this, and I'm not suggesting that anybody's close to that, at some point, would the Chinese come to the conclusion that they would rather take care of the North Korea problem than have us take care of the North Korea problem? In other words, if there was a regime change to be done, would they want to be the one running it? Now, this is a very fraught thing because of the thousands of years of various points where the Chinese took over the Korean Peninsula.
The Chinese don't want regime change.
And the
I take
Chinese
it.
don't want regime change, but if they believed that it was going to that we were headed toward a confrontation that could put the US and South Korea in North Korea, they may come to the conclusion that they want to be in command of what happens in their own region. Now, has there been any real discussion of this? No. The 19th Party Congress starts up in a week or two. The Chinese don't want any trouble. I think after the Congress happens, it's very possible that Xi Jinping, having solidified his power, will then have to go make some big decisions about how hard he's going to go press the North Koreans. But don't have any illusions about this. The relationship between North Korea and China right now is pretty terrible.
All right, so let's take two more questions, but let's get two mics out at once so we can. We'll take two at a time, and then we'll get. So, sir, here in the second row, and maybe in the back row there.
Ask a woman, Claire.
I didn't see any hands up. All right, maybe we can get one more in. All right, so
I've made crazy suggestions before, and based on certain things we know that when Kim Jong-un was in high school in Switzerland, he had a poster of Michael Jordan on his wall. We know that the only reason he talks to Dennis Rodman is because he played with Michael Jordan. We know that Chung Ju-young built a basketball arena in Pyongyang because that's what they wanted. An exact replica, by the way, of the one in Indiana. But what if we were to have a delegation that essentially said, through whatever channel, we would like to have a friendly basketball game between certain groups of people, whether they're NBA or others. Michael Jordan would be an assistant coach, or he'd probably be the coach. And we know for a fact if that were to happen, Kim Jong-un would be there. We could get a perspective on what he was doing, how he looked. He'd probably host a dinner beforehand because that's the Korean way. And at least we'd then have a way of saying, hey, we tried.
I'm with you. I'm with you.
Let's take one more question, and then
all right.
we'll
Okay.
get your answers in. Yeah.
So this is a question especially for David Sanger. You know, there's been a lot of reporting that Jim Mattis has said that if there was a nuclear, and not a nuclear, any sort of conflict, even a conventional conflict, that there would be massive loss of life beyond anyone's comprehension. But then buried in your report a few weeks ago when you were talking about North Korea and Iran, you had a reference to Jim Mattis saying that he's now confident that there are military solutions that would not involve loss of life in Seoul. And then he obviously doesn't
Very careful
expand
reader.
on that. But I was wondering if you had any speculation, what is he talking about? And is that really something he believes against the other type of thing that's out there about his perspective?
Okay, good. So basketball games first.
Sanger
let's hear
can
the
do that
basketball
one.
game.
I'm with you. Look, we got to try something new. You remember ping pong diplomacy? You know, give Nixon credit there. Ping pong diplomacy, sending Kissinger, secret talks. That was probably his biggest accomplishment that they taught with China.
Yeah.
With North Korea, this is the same scale with President Trump. You know, Trump is a sports guy. I first met him at a boxing match in Atlantic City, a Mike Tyson fight. We talked about 2 seconds. Not much of a common interest. But anyway, I like your idea. You know, I think something new. And I've said, bring Angela Merkel, the EU, get the Pope involved, do something different. You know, we've got the same
I don't
China,
know if Trump is going to
US.
come if Angela Merkel comes. So maybe he's more attracted by hanging out with Kim Jong-un.
I'm not saying it's likely. I'm just saying, for God's sakes, you know, we're stuck in this prism of just the same people, same entities, same discussions. You know, maybe this basketball, you guys, the Perry World Center, get the Philadelphia 76ers to go to, you know, something like that. Who knows? I hear the 76ers aren't too good, so they might, you know, I don't know if you want to take, well, Jordan, he's an owner now, right?
Well, I was really hoping we'd have some concrete recommendations to send down to Washington coming out of this panel. I think we just got our first clear one, which is let's hold a basketball game. David, you had a
Sure, on the
a
Mattis
response
question.
on the Mattis question.
You know, you write this stuff and you wonder, is anybody actually reading it? So I'm delighted to see
done good,
that
Fred.
you
You've done-
picked this
you've done
up
good.
deep in the story.
You've done good.
It struck me when I heard Mattis say that it did seem contrary to the warnings he and General McMaster have both offered, that if there was a resumption of hostilities, that it could be unlike anything we have ever seen before. So then the question is, what could he be talking about? Because most of the destruction you worry about in Seoul comes not from nuclear, though it's always a risk, but just from the conventional artillery that's right over the DMZ. And for those of you living in the Acela corridor here, which is all of you, the distance between where the artillery would be located and where Seoul is located is about the same distance as downtown Baltimore to downtown Washington. So that gives you an idea of how close it would be. So I had to assume that he was discussing either a new technology for suppressing the artillery fire or some kind of cyber-related or electronic warfare-related attempt that they thought had a decent way of silencing all of this. But when we pressed him on the issue, it will not surprise you, he did not bite.
You know, I know there's a threat to our country, right? And missile activity hitting our shores, there's a threat. But I think it's incumbent upon government and citizens to look for a peaceful solution. And they're out there. I think they're out there. Now, we know we got some very complex leadership on both sides, and, there's a lot of other factors. But I think what is important is find ways to explore peaceful engagement. Engagement doesn't mean peace forever. I mean, this is a very complex, long-range national security threat to our country. But I think they're out there, and I'm not sure we've explored it. And I think this is where citizens and think tanks and people like you, need to rise up and do something instead of just, talking like this. This is very useful. Claire's done a good job, hasn't she? She's tough.
And I think on that happily complimentary note, which I will accept as a closing, thank you both to our extraordinary panelists for great discussion.